Argentina's sovereign debt market is once again on very shaky ground. The country could be facing its second default in 13 years. That's as early as tomorrow. Our next guest is an expert in the sovereign debt market. In the early 90s, he was recruited to turn around the portfolio management operations for the government of New Zealand. For a closer look, we turn to Alex Ruchevsky. He's the managing partner with Recovery Partners. Alex, great to see you again. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's talk about the situation in Argentina. I've talked to a few people so far. Some people think it's a big deal. Some people do not and think that there won't be any ripple effect. Where do you come out on this?
Well, these folks are serial defaulters. If you look at the entire modern history of the state of Argentina, they've been in default or in a state of restructuring for about 35% of the time.
Okay.
So this is not unusual for either the Argentines or the people that are trying to collect money from them after having lent it to them on the expectation to be getting it back, plus interest. So, we're now coming at this on the heels of a Supreme Court decision in the United States where a minority of bondholders were successful in arguing that Argentina owed them the entire whack. In the previous restructuring, which, dates back to the default in 2001, most of the bondholders in the subsequent restructuring agreed to a big haircut, about 60%. About 7% of the bondholders, mostly hedge funds, including Elliott Management and a few others, held out and got a decision in their favor that required Argentina to pay back all the principal and all the interest. Now, that amounts, in the case of the 7% that were successful, that amounts to about $16 billion. The payment that's coming up is about that size. It's between 10 and 15. The Argentines are being a little bit coy about it. But if they fail this payment this week, they will be in an event. That will be an event of default. It's remediable as long as they make the payment within a reasonable period of time. But that would be an event of default.
From your perspective, what do you think could happen between now and tomorrow then that would prevent a default?
Not much. I mean, the Argentines were... This thing was put into a mediation in the United States, and the Argentines and the bondholders were told to sit in the same room and talk it out in front of the mediator. At last report, the Argentines were seen on a plane leaving for Buenos Aires. So nothing got talked out, nothing got resolved in the mediation, and it looks like it's headed over the cliff again.
Alex, what does that mean, though, for our viewers and us watching today in the sense that, in our discussion, in the sense that if you read a headline and you see that Argentina defaults on their bonds, how should we be reading that? I mean, you say that this happens quite frequently. It's interesting that it's between a country, the U.S. Supreme Court, and hedge funds. Yeah. I mean, that's a nuance that's new, it seems. So where do we come out in terms of how we should be looking at this?
Actually, no, there are two forms of restructuring in the sovereign arena. One is a Paris Club restructuring, which happens under the auspices of international financial institutions like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank if you default loans to them. The other type of restructuring is a London Club type restructuring, bank advisory committee restructuring, which does require the involvement of courts at certain points in the process, depending on the jurisdiction under which the bonds were issued. So in this scenario, those bonds were issued, I believe, under New York law. So U.S. courts came into play, and that's why we're dealing with U.S. courts. The Argentines are saying, oh, this is so unfair. One of the ploys they've resurrected this week is let's get a new agency involved. Let's not deal with the IMF. Let's not deal with the banks. Let's not deal with the courts. Let's develop a new agency that's not going to be so mean to us, right? And that's one of the things they put on the table, that a completely new institution needs to be built up to deal with these sovereign defaults. The reality is we've had London Club restructurings and Paris Club restructurings for the entire post-war period, and they work, as long as people are reasonable. The Argentines, again, are proving to be unreasonable counterparties in this situation.
What do you think might be then the best-case scenario in terms of what we'll see tomorrow and or going forward?
Oh, I think this thing is going to go back into the tank. The Argentines are going to default, and there's going to be additional litigation and a period of time elapsed before the thing resolves itself.
How do you think it impacts their economy?
Their economy is on its back. Their economy has been underperforming for decades. Let's not forget that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Argentine economy was a leading light in the world. It was showing the way for everybody else. They developed a lot of new technologies. Frozen food, for example, was developed, freezing of food for transport was developed by the Argentines because they were in a remote location and shipping a lot of beef north into Europe. The world was their oyster. Then came all the leftist populist policies through the 1920s, culminating with Perón in the 40s and 50s, and a string of caudillo-type people through the 70s and 80s. And really, the economy is underperformed. People are poor. It's basically not so much a third world economy, but it's certainly a second world economy, and will continue to underperform as long as it's shut out from the international capital markets.
Alex, we will leave it on that note, but Alex is going to stay with us and will give us his take on the European sovereign debt market.